Welcome back. While in most instances, economists tend to think markets work reasonably well. Most of the time they work pretty well, but not always. Sometimes markets fail. So why do markets fail? It could be a story about a coordination problem. It could be a story about market power, or it might be a story about externalities. So let's focus on externalities for a second. So remember that markets work through the price system. So when the price system doesn't work, the markets don't work. So what would cause the price system to not work properly? So the price system is supposed to value goods, including the cost to produce them and the value to the buyers. But what happens if there's a third party that's affected? Maybe there's a cost that's pushed out onto them, or there's a value that's provided to them. But that third party isn't part of a transaction. That's what we call an externality. So let's define it, and then we'll think about how we can model it. So what is an externality? So an externality is this external cost or benefit that affects a third party. So let's say that it's an uncompensated cost or benefit. All right, so this is an uncompensated cost or benefit to, we could call it a third party. Let's call it an external party, to an external party. So when we think about externalities, these can come in two types, right? Most commonly, we talk about them and think about them as a negative externality. So what's a negative externality? This is when a transaction has a negative impact on that third party. So the common example of a negative externality is going to be pollution. So a buyer and a seller agree on a price, but the production of that good creates pollution, which affects somebody else. But that external effect is not included in the price that the buyer and seller are agreeing on because the person affected by the pollution isn't part of the transaction, right? That's this idea of an externality. But an externality doesn't have to be negative. It could be positive, right? Maybe it's an action taken by somebody that has positive effects on bystanders. So what's an effect or an example of a positive externality? This could be like refurbishment of a dilapidated home, etc. Right? So let's call this revitalization. Revitalization. So this is like neighborhood revitalization. If there's an abandoned building and somebody buys it, cleans it up, gets it back into decent shape, that has positive effects on everybody else in the neighborhood. So let's model our externalities using two supply and demand diagrams. One for the negative externality and one for the positive externality. So we'll set up two supply and demand diagrams. One for the negative. So negative, we'll label price, quantity, throw in a supply curve, put in our demand curve, and let's go ahead and label in our price and quantity. So I'm going to call this P sub M and Q sub M. So why is this labeled with this sub M? So this is our market outcome. This is our outcome if we just let the market work. But with a negative externality, this is imposing a cost on bystanders. So if we want to model this from sort of a social perspective, a societal perspective, then how would we think about that? Well, that cost on the external party should be included in the cost of the good. So remember that the supply curve, that represents the cost to the seller. So if we want to think about this from a societal standpoint, then what we should do is we should add in those external costs, the externalities, as an additional cost. So what we want to do is we want to take the supply curve and we want to add to it that externality, the external cost. So now we've got this supply curve that has shifted up by the amount of this externality. So we could think of this first one, we could call it the supply of the market. We could call this second one the supply for the market's costs plus these external costs. So you could call it S sub ME. So what happens once we've modeled in these external costs? Well, notice that now that suggests that the price should actually be higher. So this is our price for the market plus those externality costs included. And the quantity should be reduced. So this is now our optimal quantity. So we'll give it a little asterisk, right? So that's our quantity when we have the market costs included plus those external costs. So notice that with a negative externality, what's the outcome? What should happen? We should produce less of it and it should cost more. So how could society remedy this? One suggestion is to put a tax on goods that have a negative externality. But we can talk about that in another video. All right, so that's a negative externality. What about a positive externality? So what if the action of two people, a buyer and a seller, has positive spillover effects? So I suggested a few minutes ago, this is like revitalization of a bad property. This is true for other actions. Another common example of a positive externality is education. So by providing a basic level of education to pretty much everybody in society, then we can all function together and that helps all of us. So your being educated actually helps me. Why? Because now we can share information through emails and you can read menus, etc. Some basic level of education and literacy allows us all to function together more easily. So you can think of lots of examples of positive externalities as well. All right, so what should those look like then if we were to try and model those? So let's set up another supply and demand diagram. So we've got quantity and price. Throw in your upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve. And let's label in, again, our market price and market quantity. All right, so this is our price when the market prices it, and here is our quantity. So how do we think about a positive externality? With a negative externality, we said this was a cost that was imposed on society. So we added that cost by increasing the supply curve. By shifting the supply curve straight up, right? Increasing the costs by that externality. It's not really increasing supply. That's not the right word. My apologies. It's shifting the supply curve straight up. All right, so what do we do for demand? Well, demand represents the value to the buyer. So this is the value to the person that bought that old property that they're revitalizing. But society's getting a benefit out of it. So we want to add that external benefit to the private buyer's benefit. So demand shifts straight up by the amount of that external benefit. All right, so this is our demand that includes the market's value, so the value to the buyer plus that external value. So what happens here when we have this additional value to others? That means that really we should be willing to pay more to revitalize homes. You're like, why would I pay more to revitalize a house if other people are going to get benefits? No. Not you, right? We as society, the collective, is getting more value out of it. And we should do more of it. So our market quantity based on the market's value plus this external value means that we really want to do more of this activity that has positive external benefits. So how do we get to the point where more of this takes place? Again, we can discuss it in other videos, but it's often a story about subsidies. This is the reason that there's subsidies for revitalizing old houses, dilapidated neighborhoods. This is the reason government subsidizes basic education, etc. So hopefully you're getting an idea of where markets maybe don't work quite as well as we would hope they would. They don't work as well when there are externalities involved, when a transaction has an effect on a third party, because the buyer and the seller aren't thinking about that third party. But if we're thinking about it as economists and as policymakers, then we want to model it in. So how do we do that? We add that external cost to our supply curve, right? Increasing the costs of producing a good to reflect the social cost. Or we take the external benefit, that social benefit, and we add it to the demand curve to reflect society's true demand for that activity. Hopefully you've got a feel for externalities and how we can model them. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.